welcome to another episode of Brand Retro. From time to time, I work with various writers and people on my team to develop content for the website. So today we're going to talk with Katie Jenison, who's done a lot of different projects for myself. We worked together for the last few years, and we really, we have great conversations about, she asks great questions, and we were actually sitting down to talk about, some different blog topics and some things that we could talk about. And one of them that came up was the difference between personal branding and corporate branding and kind of what that looks like. That's a big animal. It's a lot to package up and get down as far as time goes into one podcast. But I proposed the idea to her that, hey, let's just sit down and kind of hit the high level stuff. You can fill in the gaps after the fact, but if we can get the high level stuff, might make a good podcast and might make for good conversation. So without further ado, here we go. Hello, Katie, and welcome to the podcast. Today we're going to talk a little bit about building a personal brand and kind of what goes into that. Obviously, this is one of those deals where we're just trying to flush out some information and trying to gather some things between Katie and myself to develop some content for the website. But we figured, hey, why not record it and see if we can't make a podcast out of it too. So welcome, Katie. How's it going?
Good. How are you?
I'm good. So when it comes to creating a personal brand, where do you want to start?
I think we should start at the beginning in what a personal brand is.
I think the difference between like a personal brand and a corporate brand is that when it's a corporate brand, you're obviously, and I'm kind of dialing this back for the sake of time, but when it comes to a corporate brand, I think, it's about kind of creating a brand that lends itself to the collective, to the company mission, to the company goals. It's a little different in that you're trying to include all aspects of a bigger picture. And when it's a personal brand, it's all of that, but also your personal and individual kind of accomplishments, experience, your approach to business. Maybe it even goes as far back as how you were raised, your background, your core beliefs, and that kind of a thing. A lot of times I think people get those two things confused. And they think it's an either or. I think you have to be in the right place and time to actually benefit from a personal brand. A lot of times it's ego. A lot of people I just want to develop this personal brand. But if you're not doing the right things with it, if you're not out there speaking or out there branding yourself individually as a consultant or whatnot, I don't know if it's necessary.
Okay, so do you think that it's possible for a business, like a corporate business, to incorporate those elements of a personal brand, or is this something that's entirely different?
I think it depends on the business and how much of an individual is the face of a brand.
Okay.
So it's kind of, I think a lot of solopreneurs, entrepreneurs, when you're a one-man show, or if you're, somebody who builds a brand, from your own core beliefs, and the pieces of the brand, the elements of the brand are stemmed from the individual, I think it makes a lot of sense. You think about like a Walt Disney or a Steve Jobs or somebody like that, where you can't really disconnect the two.
Mm-hmm.
I think if you're just an individual within the organization, or if you built the brand in a way that kind of left you anonymous in that process, then I don't necessarily think it's, important or necessary to call it a personal brand. Although some of your core beliefs or your, your individual mission might be rolled into that, but you don't necessarily single yourself out in that process.
Okay. So do you think that there is like a distinction between a personal brand and someone who's trying to be like an influencer on Instagram? What's the delineation there, do you think? Or is there one?
See, I always look at a personal brand as more of a broad, it's a broader topic, and how you define what attributes or elements go into that personal brand is completely dependent on the individual. So I would think an influencer and a personal brand could be the same thing, but without that distinction, they're very separate in my opinion. So even like the elements of a personal brand, when I work with customers, a lot of times they ask, do I need a personal brand? Do I need to go down that road? And they're looking at it from a almost from like a checklist perspective. And the problem is, or the kind of the hurdle that needs to be leaped over, is the fact that everybody's checklist is going to be different because it's a personal brand.
Mm-hmm.
Like you can't really go back to the mainstay items or the milk, eggs, and bread of the situation, because every person is going to be different.
Okay, that makes sense. What about someone who wants to build a personal brand, but they're not really sure what to start? Are there things that a personal brand needs to have? Or like, I know that it can't all be cut and dried, same thing for every person to follow the same process, but are there some staples that they do need to have in their personal brand or how they tell their story?
I think it's important out of the gate to have intent. So if you want to build a personal brand, the question I'm going to ask is why. Like, where are you going with this? If you're trying to build a following to be a speaker, if you're trying to build a following on your blog or your podcast, if you're wanting to be some kind of an influencer expert in a certain space, I would say that, what's your intent and where you're going with this, so that kind of how to craft that direction. And then once you kind of define that intent, depending on why you're doing it, what's your differentiation point? So like if you say, hey, I want to build my own personal brand, possibly kind of an influencer spin on it, because I want to be known as I'm going to have a cooking podcast or a cooking show or something like that. The first question I would ask is, okay, well, what are you cooking? What do you specialize in? It's no mystery to anybody that there's a ton of cooking shows out there. There's a ton of cooking experts out there. What's going to make yours different?
Mm-hmm.
And what I'm looking for in that process and what I'm looking for in that question is the part that makes it unique and special to you. So if I say, hey, what are you going to do that's different? And you're going to say, well, I'm going to cook really good food. That's way too vague. We gotta go, okay, well, what about it? And then you might have this weird spin on it that, well, I cook everything with only 3 ingredients. Oh, okay. Well, tell me more about that. Well, the more you can flush out about the uniqueness about it, it'll hopefully tie back to a reason where you can say, well, I learned to cook from my grandma and my grandma only, and all of a sudden it's going to start just whittling itself down to a very personal and a very kind of intimate experience. And that's what builds that personal brand. Because it helps feed the direction forward as far as the marketing goes, to look, the feel, the voice, the sound, how we're going to position it. But it also kind of starts to push the competition off to the side, because now all of a sudden anybody who thought they were like you isn't, because, well, my grandma didn't teach me that and I didn't experience that. And okay, that's not how I view things. And the further you kind of get more distinct about your direction, the more unique, the more authentic, the more personal that brand is becoming to you. So
Right.
I think one of the confusing points about a personal brand versus, a corporate brand is there's a belief that you can just manufacture a personal brand. I just want to make a personal brand. And you can, but you got to go through that work to kind of pare it down and get to the kind of the meaty part of why it is you and why it is unique. Otherwise, you're just creating another brand.
Right. I think too, it's important. Not only does your personal brand differentiate you from other people and really define your target audience, but it's also what connects with them. They find their story in yours. And I think that's what keeps them coming back.
Totally agree. And because sometimes, unfortunately, or fortunately, however you want to look at it, when you're the face of a brand, if you are kind of the one out there doing the sales or doing the speaking engagements or whatever it is, just kind of through organic process, you are going to become that face of that brand. And you're eventually going to hit a crossroads of, do I continue to go down this road and somehow be the spokesperson of this corporate brand? Do I go this other way and create a personal brand? And that's going to be different for everybody. But you find yourself in those situations, and eventually you just have to make a choice, because you eventually just become known for your connection to that brand.
Mm-hmm.
It's almost impossible. I mentioned Walt Disney, I mentioned Steve Jobs, but it's almost impossible to think about some of these brands without connecting it back to the person, like a
Right.
Tesla, Elon Musk, or Bill Gates and Microsoft, or, now that they've kind of, I don't know that they intended that, that to be the case, but they get so far down that road, you can't disconnect the two. So
Mm-hmm.
now that person, and those are some pretty extreme examples, but when you're in that situation, now you have to be that much more aware of how you connect to that brand and how your personal influence, your personal decisions can now be affected,
Right.
within that brand. So like, making dumb decisions, posting stuff on social media, just basically doing things that could potentially jeopardize the big picture.
Right. Okay. Um, so you mentioned scaling the personal brand to be something much bigger. For the people that want to do that, what kind of process does that take? How can they scale their brand quickly or to a certain degree?
If in that case, if I had a customer come to me and just say, "Hey, I want to create a personal brand," we would go through that discovery process, kind of like I mentioned. But get them started, I think it's about putting the elements in place.
Mm-hmm.
So let's just say we're on the right track, and yes, we're going to build this personal brand. We've got some work to do. We've got to flesh out the details. We've got to get deeper into the why. Like we've still got work to do.
Mm-hmm.
Let's get a website going.
Mm-hmm.
Let's figure out your positioning and all this, and let's start talking about who the competition is, who's the aspire to. Because I think the elements are going to come. The elements are necessary no matter what, but the true kind of the fuel that goes in that car is, that's all the personal stuff that you're eventually going to get to. I recently did a project for a customer that her and her husband have a ranch, and they have a lot of stuff going on. They had like 5 businesses, and she'd come to me saying, "Hey, I want to create a brand." And the problem is that we sat down and we talked about her 5 businesses, and they're so abstract. It was from makeup and aesthetics on one side to beef and ranch beef cattle on the other side. And I'm like, okay, I don't know if this is going to work. Let's talk about each one of these things individually. And the more we talked about it, the more we talked about each one of them had an individual purpose and an individual intent behind each one of these silos of what is their 5 companies. But at the same time, there was a common thread that kind of wove in between them. And it
Mm-hmm.
was the culture, the background, the legacy of how she grew up and how her and her husband have adopted, what they'd learned from their grandparents. And there was a really rich story that went with the whole thing. And that's where I ended up taking her, is like, oh, let's just press pause on this 5 brand idea. Let's create a personal brand that houses all 5 brands. So
Mm-hmm.
the 5 brands can be their individual things, and they can be somewhat, cut back to just to be what they are. And then we'll let the richness and the personalization of the whole thing live with you, because you're the face of it. You're the one out there doing it. You're the one who explains it all. To your question, it's about kind of working through that process, figuring out what the must-haves are for day one, and then figuring out a hierarchy of the whole thing so that it makes sense to the consumer. Because even when we sat down, with that customer, yeah, it was super confusing because she had like 5 businesses that were, like I said, so dramatically different.
Mm-hmm.
I'm sitting there listening to her as a marketing professional, trying to piece it together. But what if I'm Joe Blow at the coffee shop trying to just figure out what do you do? What? I don't
Right.
even know. Like, so I had to help her kind of get there so that now, hopefully, when she walks into that coffee shop or that business opportunity, she can talk about the brand, which is her.
Mm-hmm.
And here's the different channels or the different pieces of what the big picture of the big company looks like.
Okay. Obviously, there's that storytelling piece that goes into it and making yourself different, but are there methods that someone can use, such as collaborating, guest posting for blogs, to get that exposure that they need? Is there something that typically works better than another?
It's going to be very different for everybody, but I would say out of the gate to work with their partners, sit down and figure out, if you're a personal brand, and you're just now starting to, extend that branch off of whatever it was you were doing before, whether it's a corporate brand or whatever, I think you have to kind of lean back on who your partners are, who's in your network, what experiences have you had? Because a lot of times, no offense to anybody, but when you build that personal brand, you kind of start at zero again. You start out
Mhm.
as a nobody, even though you've accomplished a million different things. And you can list those things on your LinkedIn profile and your website and whatnot, but you still have to kind of back it up with some of the momentum in the conversation and the endorsement of other people.
Yeah.
So the first thing I would do is I would go back to the well, so to speak, go back to those partners, the people you've worked with, and say, hey, I'm building this personal brand. Can I get a couple new referrals? Can I get a couple new reviews? Can I put a link from my website to yours or vice versa? And start to kind of just build that network of confidence so that people can go, oh, well, I don't know who this person is, but boy, they're endorsed by or partnered with so-and-so. That
Mhm.
would be a good first step. Then as you get it built, I think backing it up with content, whether it's blogs or podcasts or, maybe it's just sharing your thoughts on other articles that you see on LinkedIn or whatever, but you have to take the time to put yourself in that position
Mhm.
to be the expert. You have to show them that you know what you're talking about. You have to show them that, that you have the eye for it, that
Mhm.
you're commenting. I mean, and I'm not saying comment on every article that ever came out. Comment on the ones that you think fit your brand.
Mhm.
Because if you comment on the ones that fit your brand, you're going to attract the people that fit your brand because they're reading the same articles.
Right.
So it takes time to kind of get the feel of it, but it's strategic. It's intentional as far as where you pick and choose where to have that conversation.
Right. Yep. I think it's important not you can there's so many times you could say I am XYZ, I'm an expert at this, but you have to be able to back that up with the credibility and showcase that knowledge in order to fully offer that proof and
Yes.
to get people to trust you.
Yep. And I don't know if this is where you're going with the conversation, but you have to be prepared to be uncomfortable. If you're somebody who loves the camera, if you like the sound of your own voice, you're a rare person. And as far as I'm concerned, most people hate the sound of their own voice. They don't want to be in those situations. They don't want to be the center of attention. They don't want to do that stuff. And to build a personal brand, and again, every person can go as far as they want. You don't have to do it all, but at some point you're going to have to step out of your comfort zone and you're going to have to get on a podcast. You're going to have to write some copy. You're going to have to share an opinion that you might typically keep to yourself, because every one of those things that kind of puts you out there a little bit also shows who you are, what your belief is, and what your position is on this. And that's it. It might feel like you're just throwing that knowledge out into the wind and just kind of seeing what happens with it.
Mhm.
But what you're doing, you're fishing. You're throwing it out there to attract people that think like you, so that somebody can come back and go, "Hey, I loved your perspective on X, Y, and Z. Can you speak at my next conference?" That's
Yeah.
what you're looking for.
Everybody has different reasons for wanting to build a personal brand. What would you say to someone, or why would you think someone would want to build a personal brand without actually building a business, but making themselves have more visibility so that they can use it to advance their career or in the industry, but not have their own business?
I think it's going to be different for, if somebody came to me young in their career, young in their accomplishments, young in their experience, and said, "Hey, I want to build a personal brand." The conversation with that person would be different, because it would be like, "Yeah, we can, but just know that your road to success, or your road to, actually getting you where you want this to be, is going to be a little harder, because you've got to build up that foundation." So, like
Hmm.
in that case, I would tell that person, you have to do probably 3, 4, 5 times as much content development. Like, you got to lay down that much more content to show you're an expert, or show you know what you're talking about, than the
Hmm.
guy next to you who has 25 years of experience.
Okay.
So like if you come into it with somebody who's with 25 years of experience, you do get to kind of launch at a different point because you have the experience. You get to say less. You get to, content is king. So like, yeah, make as much content as you possibly can. But I think where you enter that personal brand race, it definitely depends on where you're at in your career and where you're at with your experience and where you're at with your connections, because it takes time. An extreme example of this is, I've had a couple clients come to me from literally bare bones scratch. Like their career was whatever it was, and they had a career shift, and now all of a sudden they want to be a consultant, and they don't have a LinkedIn page, they don't have a Facebook page, they have no social media audience, and they're like, I want to build a personal brand. And it's not to say that it can't be done, but it's way harder, because
Mm-hmm.
now we have to start from zero. Now we have to build an audience. We have to build a content funnel. We have to somehow identify, that person's unique position or perspective on that content or on that industry. It's way different. I think if you're lucky enough to, have had some experiences and been exposed to different companies, different perspectives, different, mentors and people you can kind of work with on that, you get to, in some ways, springboard off that at a different or higher point, which is
Mm-hmm.
great. And I have had situations where, somebody will say, hey, I want to build a personal brand, and I'll say, I don't think you should. I don't think it's necessary, because
Okay.
sometimes they just see other people doing it and they're like, well, I think I should do that too. And it's like, well, without the intent and without, kind of a reason, it's maybe too soon. I would back burner that until you have a little bit more foundation and then come back to it.
That makes sense. So I know that we've already talked a little bit about different personal brands that are really well known, but can you give an example of an effective personal brand and maybe one that isn't quite so mainstream, and kind of talk about what they're doing well?
I wouldn't say I've been opposed to it, but I had no intentions of ever building a personal brand for myself. And I just didn't. I didn't want to be in front of it. I didn't want to be the face of anything. I had more of a we, not me belief system on how I wanted to build my brand. And over the course of time, 2, 3, 4, 5 years of being the face of it, being the spokesperson for it, being in the situations where I had to answer the questions or I had to speak on behalf of, I was building a personal brand and didn't even quite realize it until
Mm-hmm.
somebody said, dude, you really need to get a personal brand built. And I'm like, no, I don't want to do it. I don't want to. And then the more I thought about it, the more I kind of thought through what it would take to do it. I realized I was already probably half or 3/4 of the way there. As I sat down and kind of, you're going to hear this a lot in my podcast, but like I talk about calibration a lot. Like you got to sometimes sit back and the brand retro mindset is about reflection. So like you have to sit back sometimes and think about am I on the right track? Am I doing the right thing? Am I doing what I intended to do? And you start asking yourself all these questions, and hopefully you come out of that little exercise with a sharper direction, a sharper focus, and even sometimes a pivot. Like, hey, I'm off track. I need to pivot.
Mm-hmm.
Well, for me, I didn't want a personal brand, and all of a sudden I start thinking about it, and I'm like, well, I still don't want a personal brand, but I have one. So now I have to decide if I want to neglect it or if I want to build off of it, if I want to do something with it. So, so I have chosen to embrace it to some degree. I've done a handful of speaking engagements. I'm obviously working on my podcast. I'm trying to get more content out there. But for me, I mean, you just kind of come to that crossroads where if you're already kind of in that tunnel, you got to think about how it benefits you and benefits the company and benefits the brand, and decide if you want to do it. I think there's a lot of, I mentioned the big ones, right? But I think
Mm-hmm.
there's a lot of scenarios where, maybe you've merged the concepts. Maybe you've built a brand that's, Johnson's Plumbing. Well, you've kind of taken the corporate brand and the personal brand concepts, and you've merged them together to just make something that's you, right? You
Mm-hmm.
know, I think for those people, I think they shorten the branding process. I think they make it a little easier on themselves in some way. But I think where it's difficult is for the people who are trying to create both. They're trying to create this separate entity, which is their brand, whether it's, like I said, whether it's Tesla or whatever it is,
Mm-hmm.
but yet they're such a proponent of it. They're such an advocate of what they're doing. They can't help but be the face of the whole thing.
Mm-hmm.
Like a prime example, and you should know who this is, hopefully. Stan Lee from Marvel Comics.
Yep.
So like when Marvel Comics was in their heyday, everybody was anonymous. All the artists were anonymous, like not anonymous that their names weren't used, but everything was branded and positioned as Marvel.
Mm-hmm.
And when Stan Lee got involved, he just didn't think that, the way that they were portrayed and the way the message was, it didn't have the energy, it didn't have the sounds and all these different things that it didn't carry the level of excitement that he believed it should. He started putting himself out there. He started writing columns in the back of comic books. He started doing the voiceovers on cartoons. He started doing these cameos in movies and on TV shows. And like I think he intentionally put himself out there, but he, without question, created a personal brand
Mm-hmm.
for himself that now is forever connected to
Right.
Marvel Comics.
Yep.
I mean, that's a pretty extreme example, but you can just see the idea where there was almost like a fork in the road, and the
Mm-hmm.
personal and the corporate split, and he chose to run with it.
It's a really good example. What do you think that is like the most surprising thing for someone who's trying to build a personal brand? Like something that they didn't realize would be such a big deal going into it, or maybe even as frustrating? And how do they get past that?
I think it's the amount of time and the work that goes into it. When you're not focused on it, and to some degree, when you don't care about it, the good things that happen, whether it's hey, can you speak at our conference, or hey, can you write this blog? Everything feels like a gift, right? Because you're not focused. You don't necessarily care either way because you're not intentionally trying to build that personal brand. So when the little things happen, you're like, oh, that's cool. Oh yeah. And it kind of strokes your ego in a different way.
Mm-hmm.
But when you draw a line in the sand and you're like, hey, I'm going to build a personal brand, now you're doing it every day. You're writing the content, you're doing the podcast, like you're kind of waiting for that approval, right? You're waiting for somebody to notice, and you're waiting for somebody to kind of call you out on it and say, hey,
Mm-hmm.
oh my God, I've seen this and your brand is amazing. It doesn't happen fast enough. So
Oh.
as you're doing that, you got to keep your chin up and you just got to remember it's a process, and you got to remember that it takes time.
Mm-hmm.
But when you intentionally kind of set out to do it, something in your mind changes, and it's really easy to feel like, I don't know if this is working. I don't know if I'm doing it right.
Yep.
Be patient. It's just different. Like I said, when you're not intentionally doing it, everything's a gift, and you feel like it's happening. You feel like it's happening more frequently than it really is.
Mm-hmm.
And then when you intentionally do it, all of a sudden it's not happening at all.
Yep.
Then it's
When you're
like,
really
oh no.
invested in it.
Yeah. So that's probably the biggest thing, is to be patient, and to maybe phrase that better, realistic expectations.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think this is a big secret, but I think it's really common for people to throw a post on social media or to do something and expect instant results.
Mm-hmm.
Like, I threw this blog out there and oh my God, only 2 people have listened to it. It's like, well, that was like a day ago. So it
Yeah.
takes time. So I think it's about realistic expectations, and we talk about it in the build up process, but those expectations are all tethered to the why, and they're tethered to the authenticity, and they're so focus on that beginning process where you're flushing out all the details of what goes into that personal brand, because the better job you do at that, the quicker you're going to see those results.
Mm-hmm. And it's going to be people who are actually engaged and want to see it versus people who just maybe saw one social media post and hit like, and now, they're not actually engaging with anything else. They're not following your content. They're not clicking over to your website or your blog. They're not going to hire you to do anything. They just came for that one thing.
Right. And, this is a pretty vague example, but let's say you get a year. Let's say you've been hitting it hard for a year. I've been doing blogs, I've been doing podcasts, and I'm really just cranking the content out. A year goes by and you're still not happy with the results, then either you're in the wrong place or your expectations are too high. Mm-hmm. It's got to be one of the two. So let's sit down and talk about your expectations and see what maybe you're doing better than you think, mm-hmm. or maybe you're doing as bad as you think, and we're just all in the wrong places. Where's your audience? We have to find them. Yep. So it could be one of the two, but yeah, it's just about, kind of just really being intentional, focused, and trying to figure out if the brand aligns with the audience, and then what's realistic as far as expectations. And it's just a process. That's where the patience has to come.
Mm-hmm. It's a marathon, not a sprint.
Absolutely. Yep. I have a couple articles that I found too in prep for this. I'll send them to you if they can be of any use to you. Sure. And then I'll tag you. So what happens is now is I'll save this down. I'll submit the file. I'll write a little brief description and kind of give them all the elements. Mm-hmm. And then I'll tag you in it so that, when it goes live, you'll just get an email and say, hey, the podcast went live, and then you can do what you want with it if you want to share it or whatever.
Okay.
Awesome. Nice job. Sounds good. And with that, Katie, thank you again for sitting down with me to have this discussion about personal branding. As I've mentioned in a couple of the previous podcasts, there is a new Cyberdogz website coming. It should be launching very, very soon. And a lot of this content, a lot of the discussions, the podcast, blogs that have more specifics on some of these topics will also be on that new website. So stay tuned for that. We will keep you posted as well. But you can check us out at cyberdogzmarketing.com.